There is a man, Grant Cardone, who is one of many who talks about how to build a brand. I found it interesting in one or more videos of his. A year ago, I was watching him talking about his perspective that some people hide who they are and don't even want to be visible. And I found that fascinating, and I've thought about it. Why, amongst other reasons, why might we want to hide who we are? Here are some thoughts. First of all, perhaps who we are has been envied by some people. Or perhaps our ideas have been poo-pooed because they didn't come after a time in college culminating in a degree in some field, hence told we're not a trained professional. Instead told that we're an amateur, or shall we say an armchair philosopher, armchair psychologist, armchair citizen, armchair thinker, armchair human being, as opposed to the trained professional human beings, and the trained professional thoughts and the trained professional brains in general, and the trained professional observer. And ultimately, the person with a document in hand that says they're a trained professional, regardless of anything else. In other words, 2 minutes before you get this document, you are not a trained professional, and 2 seconds after you acquire the document, you are a bona fide trained professional. And everybody else is an amateur at best, if not a fraud. In other words, we're told our thinking is fraudulent even, or amateurish, or childish, or incomplete, or unscientific, or unsophisticated, if it is not accompanied by a sheet of paper that says, so-and-so has been told by so-and-so body of people that they are now a trained professional thinker in some area, and that everybody else is not. And that furthermore, if you try to monetize what you think or write about in certain venues, you could go to prison for practicing without a trained professional document called a license. And of course, once having this degree, one is deemed fully trained, not 99% trained perhaps, or 50% trained, and for what period of time, or 2% trained, but one is either trained or not trained, depending on the document in possession, somewhere in one's home perhaps, or originally issued by a trained professional brick-and-mortar issuing body. Now, in the Catholic Church, up until the 1500s, when Martin Luther came upon the scene, and the Gutenberg press, 40 years before him, I believe, those deemed to have the knowledge, the training, and were thus the trained professionals, were the priests, and they were receiving their training from the Almighty above, it was stated. Everybody else was an amateur at best, and encroaching on turf. Now perhaps, just perhaps we might speculate, the download source is not an almighty creator, as it was once said, or some say today, but the Professor Almighty, and the books Almighty. And after a period of time in contact with the almighty professors and the almighty books, one is declared that these two have rubbed off in sufficient fashion to have performed a download function or a kind of osmosis effect, and the person is now declared trained, or imprinted, you might say, permanently also, and 100%. Next, my experience is that while it would be easy to offer thus to the public that one has a college degree of such and such nature, and that this is their credential in part, stating that they have massive amounts of skill, expertise. Yet, if one doesn't have this document, how does one demonstrate any kind of competency whatsoever? Compared, say, to a young child. This, then, is where I think the ideas of advocating for oneself or writing down one's accomplishments and determining what, say, Brian Tracy has talked of as being one's USPs. You might call them thus one's unique selling propositions are so critical. This, of course, is right up in line with people like Socrates, who said, know thyself, or in other words, know your plus points especially. Know your credentials if they are not academic degrees. Sun Tzu, also in The Art of War, had stated that if you know yourself and your enemy, or shall we say your competitor, victory is assured. Or I might say myself, one will have a far better time in life. Well, knowing yourself and knowing your competitor, your so-called enemy, might mean, in particular, knowing the plus points of yourself versus the plus points of the other individuals, and also, of course, one's liabilities, one's negatives, one's weaknesses compared to one's competitor too. But of course, then this can get quite murky. If we have, for instance, a degree in hand, that is quite tangible. It's there or it isn't. Likewise, some have used a credential of having millions of dollars, that too quite tangible to explain. But how, on the other hand, to demonstrate creativity, shall we say, or unique ideas, or shall we say love, or lots of empathy, or patience? One woman has stated in her book on advocating for yourself that if a housewife were to itemize all she does for her family, on average it would be worth $100,000 minimum a year in compensation in dollars and cents, that is. In other words, she's urging the housewife, so to speak, to know their credentials if it is not a degree. Another thought that may stymie some people from knowing what their credentials are of a non-academic nature is what you might call a fear of boasting. In other words, there's one thing regarding having assets, and there's another thing regarding that you generated these assets out of thin air, as opposed to the input that went into creating them and giving credit thus. You might say then, there's two approaches to proffering any credential, especially of a non-academic nature. You state the skill set or the asset, and then stating where it came from. Was it self-generated, as if creating out of nothing? Are you some kind of a god or goddess, or was there a chain of events that you acknowledge? If the latter, my point is not boasting is involved. No boasting involved. Next, there may be issues of wealth guilt. If one has a very strong asset, one may hide it from others or even deny to oneself one has it under the feeling or thought, sometimes erroneous, that one stole the time, one stole the money to get the asset, whether it was by studying or who knows what. Hence, some Silicon Valley wealthy executives in the financial sense have felt wealth guilt, actually, over how they were able to generate that money, and the company, of course, in general. Now, yet another reason, I think, looking back on my life and what I've read and watched, as to why some of us hide our talent under a bushel, if you will, that coming from Christian scriptures, is because perhaps the minute we say anything regarding people, there will be negative feedback from some others. If we were to talk about an inanimate object like a tree or a car, that might be one thing. But where there are people involved, there tends to be disagreement, often vehement in nature. There then are clashes in what you might call defense mechanism usage, versus, of course, too, what is called freedom from such. There's, to put it another way, clashes in who is using what you call an addictive substance, whether chemical in nature or not, and who isn't. There are clashes in what you consider violence or being unloving. There are clashes in what you might call what is needed versus what is a comfort item or luxury. There are clashes then tied into this over religion and politics and how to live with other people, and matters, of course, of sexuality and old age, and how children are to be raised best. There are also clashes concerning money, the use of it, the acquiring of it, and how. So in many ways, the minute we say something about people, we are making some comment that will be a thorn in the side to at least one other person on the planet, if not many more. And we will probably hear something about it. Next, there are the clashes over whether someone else is morally culpable. Shall we say, did they choose to do it, or was it forced upon them? And this in turn based upon differences of opinion and more concerning free will versus determinism. There are also clashes concerning what we call a handicap, and who is a, quote, victim, and who and to what extent are we supposed to take responsibility, it is said, for our feelings, versus everybody else bending over double backwards to do so for us. In other words, to what extent are we children of 2 years of age, needing constant guidance? There are also clashes as to what constitutes a great education, to include, let's say, just the basics K through 12, and what subjects are most appropriate to call oneself maximally educated at this level. Now, earlier I brought up the concept also of envy. If we have a talent, some people would probably feel very discomforted, uncomfortable, angry, if that talent cannot be easily shared with them, inculcated in them, as if by a download. There may, of course, then be issues of stating that someone got an asset by hook and crook, and thus that it is, quote, not fair, that so-and-so has an asset and others don't, including the person negative in manner. Next, there are those who want to feel superior to some others, as many as possible, except for their particular group perhaps, and they will pick out one or more items to check on, shall we say, such that they are doing better in that department and so feel superior overall in terms of safety. Shall we call it a form of power then? Power ultimately over their fears of harm. And then there are those who love to criticize, love to tear down simply because they enjoy it. They love seeing people suffer, and if they can have a hand in it, all the more, and the more the merrier, as long, of course, as they don't cut off the hand that feeds them, or spit in the wind, so to speak. They need some allies to feed them, so to speak, to have power, so to speak, in general, clout, information, sexual satisfaction, support in illness and old age, and so on. Next, I believe some people hide, quote, their light under a bushel concerning showing it to others, if not even awareness of it themselves in their own mind's eye. because they have certain traits of personality, shall we say, that they know perhaps in the back of their mind from past experience many people might be unhappy with. In other words, if a person is chronically angry, a chronic blamer, is chronically fearful, these individuals probably will not be some people's favorite person to be around. Hence the phrase, somewhat telling, to have a friend, you must first be a friend. Then there are those who don't believe in their product very much, and that's a questionable entity right there also. To the extent you don't believe your product is very good, one probably won't make much effort trying to sell it. There may be also confusion and an all-or-nothing situation in a creator's mind, shall we say, a seller's mind, what have you. That if someone can't perform a complete transformation on somebody's life and overnight, that their product is useless. There might be thus an all-or-nothing scenario in one's mind, that you perform an instant cure on a person and they're now in Shangri-La, enlightened, so to speak, versus still on a lower plane. One might feel thus that one is offering only a drug of choice rather than a cure. But of course, if this were generally true, that most products are a drug of choice, well then, is that drug of choice heroin? Is it a nuclear weapon to wipe out everybody except your friends? Or is it maybe a hamburger or a night out on the town that harms nobody else? Is it a movie? Some thus refer, like Chris Fox in one of his books, Right to Market, as selling people what they want, or you might say what they most need in the short term and can digest quickly, yet not something very egregious, again, heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, etc. Or maliciousness. Also, another factor. If somebody, as a customer, has a favorite denial they engage in, as Christo has said, his viewpoint being lies we tell ourselves about something keenly important, you might call it a premise. If our basic model of the world and the product therein, our brand, shall you say, does not support and vet that person's denial, our whole product and brand might be instantly rejected. And going back a bit, I referred to the need to advocate for yourself, first to yourself and then others, what your strengths are, what your unique selling propositions are, say. But if they are somewhat intangible, and if one rarely hears from outside sources what they are, in terms of, shall we say, a compliment, then how are we to know for sure with some degree of confidence that we even have these traits, these assets, and that we're not just conjuring up these things out of thin air with little proof but a lot of wishful thinking? Also along the lines then of, if I had this asset, why didn't more people tell me I had it? We must first thus try to understand why we can have a very profoundly strong asset and only hear maybe 2 compliments our whole lifetime from a few outside sources that we indeed have it. Why and how could this be? Also, in general, are we offering a product or service, or are we the product or service? In other words, if we're offering a drug, so to speak, or drug of choice, that's one matter. But what if we claim to be offering uplifting, emotional support just by our very presence? Do we believe we are quite along the line in this direction? And how do we say this with confidence to some degree? Where is our intangible or tangible proofs that we tell ourselves, other than what we might just worry about being wishful thinking, which can really waffle day to day? In other words, to put it another way, If we claim to be highly uplifting, highly empathetic, highly loving, do we have a sufficient amount of data that we can muster from day to day in our mind's eye that carries us through day to day of sufficient nature that we do believe this quite well? As opposed to thinking that we are just conjuring up wishful thinking because we don't have a lot of money to offer alternatively, or some fantastic widget, or maybe great looks and more. Or maybe we have a great asset, but we don't know how to communicate that we have that asset if a number of people also state they have it but don't. And the public, very credulous, very skeptical, saying, yeah, sure, prove it to me that you have that asset. Well, can we actually do this? Do we have exposure time with people for them to see us almost day to day or day by day? Or can we, again, proffer some kind of non-academic credentials to claim that we deserve special consideration from the rest of the people who may just make any claim under the sun? Indeed, too, perhaps many people hide certain assets, you might call it their light under a bushel, because they might have a considerable degree of a negative asset, call it a liability, in the respect department. In other words, just because one is a great plumber or great electrician does not mean that they take a shower every day, so to speak, emotionally. They may smell, so to speak, in terms of somebody who's fantastic at any skill except getting in the shower once every 6 months or more, but not know it because it's an emotional issue that needs a real shower or tune-up or growth. This can come again from issues of having chronic anger, chronic fears, chronic guilt, or, shall we say also, a considerable degree of disrespect, and that in turn from, in part, a lack of appropriate words to communicate matters, and in turn to understand people respectfully, where they come from, that they do the best they can. One final thought, perhaps, if I were to say final and end here, is that perhaps one of the most critical parts of selling anything, including then putting your name out there, your brand, your ideas, your very self, is that it probably takes a great deal of self-acceptance to know that you are the best that you can be by the laws of the universe, and that whatever criticism we receive, we take into account that nonetheless we've done the best we can at this present time, this by some circles being called self-acceptance of a high nature. Those, on the other hand, who think they are completely, or in general, self-created, or that they could always have done better if they had only, quote, tried harder, will surely have a very difficult time when criticized, because they will take the criticism to heart, I believe, thinking that, yes, I agree, I'm not, quote, what I could have been if only this or if only that, failing to realize that the very criticizer could have probably solved world hunger or gotten us to Mars overnight by now, or who knows what, solved all poverty, all drug addictions, everything on the planet, if only they too, the criticizer, had tried harder, like the criticizer is implying the criticized person could have done in general. To realize all this is the rubric, I believe, the rubric of self-acceptance, of knowing one has limits thus, that one's life, one's character, one's everything is entirely dictated by the laws of the universe, cause and effect. To think otherwise is to not only not accept who we are, our limitations, shall we say, but to not accept that we are not gods and goddesses that can supposedly, if the theory were right, pull a rabbit out of a hat, or generate something out of nowhere with wishful thinking. Not that I know exactly the theories concerning gods and goddesses or what not, but surely if we think we can do such, we will be very vulnerable to criticism. Because the criticizer, I believe, in the end is stating that we could have done something other than who we are at this point in time by the laws of the universe and the resources and constraints that were handed us. The minute we conclude with 99% certainty that we are as we are, and let the chips fall where they may, even if that were that we are fire, shall we say, and not many people like fire, perhaps, as a friend, well then, we have self-acceptance. One last parting thought, and not a tiny one, is that some people, I believe, might think that their product or very presence causes others to be pained, or some people. And then the question is, to what degree and in what areas is someone else responsible for their own feelings? Versus, shall we say, there being what you might call victimization or a crime occurring or something of that nature. Who is responsible and to what degree for their feelings is a very important question. For we cannot exist on the planet and come out of a cubbyhole or cave, shall we say, without somebody feeling discomfort or more, sometimes anger. Thus, if we hide who we are and our product, shall we say, or our service, because we're concerned that somebody feels discomfort because we exist on the planet and our product or service, I think we're in deep problematic problem. We're in deep trouble. We must come to conclude, I believe, as I've struggled to, that everybody has some venues in which they must take responsibility for their feelings. And yet the other realm, that doesn't mean we can simply run over them with a 10-ton truck just for the fun of it and say, well, if they're screaming in pain, it's their fault because they're not taking responsibility for their feelings. My present feelings, or thoughts rather, are that perhaps there are two areas in which it can be very difficult for others to untangle and deal with painful feelings. First is if they are insulted with our words, by disrespect thus incurred. Second, more problematic perhaps, is if their brains are numbed by outside forces, and it is said that this is medicine. And again, it is forced upon them, and upon which they cannot do any real thinking, including thinking about why they feel angry, or fearful, or guilty. In fact, these feelings may recede so much under the influence of chemical drugs forced upon such an individual that they are even unaware they had those feelings before and have anything to be worked on. So again, to recap on this last end here, perhaps we need to realize that if someone feels pained over our very existence on this planet, or proximity to us, our product, or we the product or service, perhaps we need to differentiate between what is their responsibility to deal with regarding their painful feelings, shall we say, often emotionally, and what is our bailiwick. If we're considerably disrespectful, then that is very hard, I believe, for others to decode. And secondly, to force somebody else to not be able to think, and for this to go on chronically, often by legal means, this too is very problematic, because then they can't even work on their angry feelings, their fears, their guilt feelings, and additionally, they may not even be aware they have these significantly, except from very occasional times to times, if their brains are largely numbed and they have no option on the matter. My thoughts, then.